The broadcast of Family Ties offered the ultimate American safe haven. The reality on the soundstage was a quiet, biological collapse. Every warm family moment and perfectly timed punchline was financed by immense physical trauma, a suppressed neurological disorder, an acid-burned esophagus, a shattered skeletal frame, and a chemically rewired child's brain. The network required flawless continuity, and the cast delivered it by eroding their own anatomy. Primetime comedy was not a family. It was a highly efficient industrial machine operating in plain sight. The television sound stages of the 1980s and 1990s were engineered to project an image of absolute stability. The sets representing the Keaton family home in Family Ties or the Lambert household in Step by Step were constructed with meticulous attention to lighting, angles, and warmth. To the audience viewing from their living rooms, these environments represented the ultimate safe haven. However, stepping onto the linoleum floors of these sets revealed a starkly different reality. It was a high-pressure, windowless industrial environment driven strictly by production schedules and audience ratings. Within this closed ecosystem, the human beings employed to portray these characters were subjected to a set of rules that completely ignored biological reality. The fundamental operational philosophy of the sitcom industry during this era was the demand for flawless consistency. The characters were products, and the actors were the delivery mechanisms. There was zero tolerance for physical deterioration, psychological instability, or biological unpredictability. If an actor's body or mind began to fail, the immediate reaction of the industry was not medical intervention or empathy. It was threat assessment. An ailing actor was a depreciating asset, a liability that threatened the shooting schedule and the financial bottom line of the network. Because of this unspoken but heavily enforced rule, the actors developed a survival instinct based entirely on concealment. The sheer magnitude of this psychological pressure manifested physically the moment the actors' own bodies began to betray them. The fear of the studio executives far outweighed the fear of the disease itself. By the time he was leading the sitcom Spin City, Michael J. Fox was an undisputed anchor of television comedy. Yet, when his biology had begun to falter from young-onset Parkinson's disease, first manifesting years earlier on a film set, his approach to his television work was heavily influenced by the industry's demand for perfection. The onset of young-onset Parkinson's disease does not typically announce itself with a massive physical collapse. It begins microscopically. For Fox, it manifested as a persistent, uncontrollable twitch in his left pinky finger. From a forensic neurological perspective, this tremor was the external symptom of a catastrophic internal failure. Deep within his brain, the substantia nigra was slowly dying, shutting down the production of dopamine, the vital neurotransmitter required for smooth, controlled muscle movement. His nervous system was misfiring, sending rogue signals to the muscles in his hand. When Fox first registered this neurological malfunction, he did not immediately halt production. He did not seek out the studio medic or ask the producers for a hiatus to consult neurologists. His immediate overriding reflex was to hide the tremor. He understood implicitly that the machine he worked for had no use for a defective leading man. The camera lenses used on a sitcom set are entirely unforgiving. They capture every micro-expression and every unintended movement. Therefore, Fox had to actively suppress a neurological disorder while simultaneously performing complex choreography and delivering rapid dialogue. This required an immense cognitive and physical load. While the audience saw a flawless leading man delivering a punchline, Fox was internally fighting a war against his own central nervous system. He developed highly specific physical coping mechanisms. He would forcefully jam his trembling hand deep into his trouser pockets, gripping the fabric tightly to mask the vibration. He would lean heavily on props, clutching the back of a sofa or gripping a coffee mug with excessive force to ground the rogue electrical signals shooting through his arm. The stress of this continuous concealment triggers a physiological response. The human body, when forced to maintain a state of constant vigilance and fear of discovery, floods the bloodstream with cortisol and adrenaline. Fox was operating in a sustained state of fight or flight, right in the middle of a brightly lit comedy set. He was chemically exhausting his own body to maintain the illusion of health. The tragedy here is not simply the onset of Parkinson's. It is the environment that made a man feel that his progressive neurological decay was a professional secret he had to take extraordinary, exhausting measures to hide. He was slowly being crushed between the reality of his failing brain and the rigid, unyielding demands of the sitcom format. This terrifying architecture of concealment was not a new phenomenon. It was a deeply ingrained survival tactic inherited from the generation of television actors that preceded the 1980s boom. The template for this specific brand of psychological torture was perhaps best exemplified by Robert Reed, the actor who portrayed Mike Brady on The Brady Bunch. While this show aired slightly earlier, it established the precise blueprint for the perfect television family that shows like Family Ties and Step by Step later emulated. Robert Reed was the ultimate patriarch of the American living room. He was cast to project unwavering moral authority, traditional masculinity, and heterosexual stability. However, Reed's biological and personal reality was in direct opposition to the character he was contracted to play. He was a closeted gay man living through the most dangerous and stigmatized periods in modern medical history. For Reed, the television set was an active hostile zone. The sitcom machine required him to suppress his fundamental identity to maintain his employment and his public standing. This was a psychological compartmentalization so extreme that it borders on self-erasure. He had to meticulously police his mannerisms, his speech patterns, and his off-screen associations. The fear of being outed by the tabloid press was a constant low-level hum of anxiety, but the deeper fear was the reaction of the studio system. If the illusion of the wholesome father figure was shattered, the network would instantly sever ties, viewing him as toxic to their family-friendly advertisers. This psychological burden was a constant heavy toll. The energy required to maintain this dual existence, to project an idealized version of family life while aggressively suppressing his own reality, is a form of slow psychological erosion. Both Fox and Reed illustrate the fundamental baseline of the sitcom studio environment. It is a machine that demands absolute compliance from the human body. The actor is not viewed as an organism susceptible to disease, fatigue, or genetic reality. The actor is viewed as a functional component of a larger commercial engine. When that component begins to fail, whether through a misfiring substantia nigra or a collapsing immune system, the component is expected to fix itself, or, at the very least, hide the damage completely so as not to disrupt the visual aesthetic of the product. This environment establishes a chilling precedent. If the established adult anchors of these shows, men with power, wealth, and status, felt terrified enough to hide severe, life-altering medical conditions from their employers. What impact would this ruthless environment have on the more vulnerable components of the machine? The studio system demonstrated clearly that weakness would not be tolerated. Perfection was the only accepted currency. For an adult, this pressure is enough to cause severe psychological distress and physical exhaustion. But a television set is not solely populated by adults. These shows required children and teenagers to populate the fictional households. These younger actors were brought into the exact same sterile, unforgiving environment. They were placed under the same high-intensity lights, subjected to the same grueling schedules, and evaluated by the exact same executives who demanded biological perfection. However, unlike adults who possess fully formed frontal lobes and established coping mechanisms, these young actors entered the machine while their bodies and brains were still actively developing. They were forced to learn the rules of survival in an environment that actively suppressed human vulnerability. They watched the adults around them mask their pain, hide their flaws, and smile on command regardless of their internal reality. This taught the younger generation a lethal lesson. Your natural body is not acceptable. Your biological needs are secondary to the shooting schedule. This sets the stage for a much more violent form of destruction. When the machine applies this level of pressure to a teenager undergoing puberty or a child whose neural pathways are just beginning to map the world, the results are catastrophic. The psychological demand to be perfect transforms into physical self-destruction. The need to deliver the punchline transforms into neurological conditioning. The studio stops being a workplace and becomes a laboratory where human development is forcefully altered to fit the dimensions of a television screen. The television studio is an environment defined by extreme, unnatural control. The temperature is regulated to prevent the actors from sweating under the massive arrays of overhead tungsten lighting. The ambient noise is deadened by thick acoustic paneling. Within this sterile, hermetically sealed box, the chaotic reality of human biology is viewed as a disruption that must be managed, suppressed, or entirely eradicated. When we look at the younger cast members of Family Ties, we see the horrifying consequences of forcing developing human organisms to conform to the rigid, mathematically precise dimensions of a television screen. For the young women cast in these roles, the studio was not merely a workplace. It was a highly judgmental environment that implicitly demanded severe physical compromises as the price of admission. Consider Justine Bateman. To the millions tuning in every week, she was Mallory Keaton, the beautiful, fashion-obsessed, slightly superficial teenage daughter. She was the visual anchor for a specific demographic, a template of adolescent perfection. But the biological reality of a teenage girl is not static. A young woman's body naturally shifts, expands, and changes as it navigates the hormonal surges of puberty and early adulthood. The sitcom machine, however, does not tolerate natural biological progression. The network executives and producers required visual continuity. They demanded that the aesthetic of Mallory Keaton remain frozen in time, maintaining a specific, highly marketable silhouette. The camera lens is notoriously predatory. It flattens the image and famously adds perceived weight to the subject. To counter this optical illusion, the actor is pressured to maintain an artificially low body mass index. For Bateman, the pressure was not an abstract concept. It was a daily crushing reality measured in inches by the wardrobe department. Her fatal weakness was the deep-seated internalization of this external corporate demand. She began to equate her physical volume, the literal space her body occupied in the world, with her professional worth and her right to exist on that soundstage. When an adolescent mind internalizes this level of commodification, the natural survival instinct is inverted. The body is no longer viewed as a vessel to be nourished. It becomes an enemy to be conquered, a liability that must be aggressively managed. To maintain the required physical dimensions of her character, Bateman engaged in a sustained, brutal campaign of biological destruction. Between the bright, cheerful takes of family comedy, while the crew adjusted the microphones and the lighting technicians tweaked the gels, Bateman would retreat to the sterile, fluorescent-lit confines of the studio bathrooms. She would lock the door, isolating herself from the manufactured warmth of the Keaton household, to perform a daily act of physical violence upon herself. She would force her fingers deep down her throat to trigger the gag reflex. This is not a gentle process. It is a violent reversal of the human digestive system. From a forensic, anatomical perspective, the damage inflicted by chronic bulimia nervosa is catastrophic. The human stomach is designed to contain powerful gastric acids, primarily hydrochloric acid, which registers between 1.5 and 3.5 on the pH scale, acidic enough to dissolve solid meat and bone. The stomach is protected from this corrosive fluid by a thick, specialized mucosal lining. However, the esophagus, the muscular tube connecting the throat to the stomach, possesses no such protection. When Bateman forced herself to vomit, she was aggressively driving this highly corrosive hydrochloric acid backward through the lower esophageal sphincter. The acid would coat the delicate, unprotected lining of her esophagus. With every single episode she purged, she was literally burning her own internal tissues. The acid causes severe inflammation, micro-lacerations, and the slow, agonizing erosion of the esophageal wall. She was incinerating her digestive tract to ensure her waistline met the approval of men sitting in executive screening rooms. The destruction did not stop at the throat. As the stomach acid rushed upward into her mouth, it coated her teeth. The human mouth is not equipped to handle a daily wash of highly corrosive gastric acid. The hydroxyapatite crystals that form tooth enamel had been systematically dissolved during her years on set. Enamel does not regenerate. Once it is chemically stripped away, the underlying dentin is permanently exposed. This results in extreme chronic dental hypersensitivity. Every intake of hot or cold fluid, every intake of cold air registers as a sharp, piercing pain signal firing directly into the dental pulp nerves. The structural integrity of her teeth had been compromised, necessitating massive, painful, and invasive dental reconstructions simply to restore basic mechanical function. Imagine the sheer, jarring psychological dissonance of this existence. Bateman would emerge from the bathroom stall, her throat raw and burning with chemical lesions, her teeth stripped of their protective armor, her heart rate spiking from the physical exertion of vomiting. She would wipe her mouth, allow the makeup artist to reapply her foundation to hide the pallor of malnutrition, and step back under the searing studio lights. The director would call action, and she would instantly project the effervescent, carefree smile of Mallory Keaton. She was slowly dissolving her own internal organs, breaking down her skeletal defenses simply to buy the privilege of being televised. The studio did not register this trauma. As long as she fit into the designer jeans pulled by the wardrobe department, As long as there was no visible excess fat on the monitors, her slow-motion biological suicide was not just permitted, it was implicitly required. The system valued the image of the girl over the actual tissue and bone of the human being. While Justine Bateman's body was being destroyed by the demands of the camera, another form of invisible destruction was occurring on the exact same set. This trauma was not physical, it was neurological. It was the systematic structural alteration of a child's developing brain. Brian Bonsall was brought onto the set of Family Ties to play the youngest child, Andrew Andy Keaton, when he was just 5 years old. The precise gravity of what happened to Bonsall is rooted in the neurobiology of a 5-year-old child. At age 5, the human brain is in a state of hyperplasticity. It is not a fixed organ. It is a highly malleable, rapidly organizing network of synapses. A child's brain is essentially a biological sponge, frantically absorbing environmental stimuli to map the world and establish the fundamental neural pathways that will dictate emotional regulation, social interaction, and self-worth for the rest of their life. In a normal environment, a child learns these concepts through natural, unpredictable interactions with parents, peers, and their surroundings. They learn cause and effect, they learn how to process disappointment, and they learn the value of unconditional love. Brian Bonsall's developing brain was forcefully removed from a natural environment and transplanted into a highly engineered synthetic ecosystem. His neural pathways were hijacked by the sitcom production process. When a 5-year-old actor steps onto a multi-camera sitcom set, they are subjected to a highly specific, repetitive behavioral conditioning loop. Bonsall was handed a script containing words written by adult comedy writers. He was placed on a specific mark on the floor. He was instructed to say those words with a specific inflection. When he successfully executed this command, the studio utilized a mechanical trigger. The applause sign flashed in the studio audience, or the sound engineers primed the laugh track. Hundreds of adults would instantly erupt into synchronized laughter and cheering directed entirely at him. Inside Bonsall's 5-year-old brain, this triggered a massive, unnatural neurochemical event. The brain's reward center, the ventral tegmental area, flooded his synapses with dopamine, the neurotransmitter responsible for feelings of intense pleasure, reward, and motivation. Dopamine is the primary chemical driver of human learning. When a behavior is followed by a massive dopamine release, the brain aggressively wires itself to repeat that behavior. In a laboratory setting, this is known as operant conditioning. The studio had effectively placed a human child inside a Skinner box. Over the course of months and years, repeating this cycle hundreds of times, the network physically altered the architecture of Bonsall's brain. They established a closed artificial dopamine loop. His developing neural networks were programmed to understand a singular, terrifying biological directive. My only value, my only source of joy, and my only method of survival is to make a crowd of strangers laugh on command. This is not child rearing. This is the manufacturing of a biological entertainment algorithm. The studio executives did not care about his cognitive development. They cared that he was adorable, that he could memorize his lines, and that his presence boosted the Nielsen ratings. The tragedy of this neurological interference is what the child fails to learn. Because Bonsall's brain was so heavily incentivized to seek the immediate massive dopamine rush of an audience's laughter, the neural pathways required for normal, quiet human existence began to atrophy. He was never taught how to process boredom. He was never taught how to navigate the complex, unscripted nuances of genuine human empathy. Because on a sitcom set, every emotion is planned, rehearsed, and resolved in 22 minutes. He was never taught how to regulate his own emotions or self-soothe without the external validation of a cheering crowd. The studio successfully trained a biological organism to be a flawless punchline delivery system. They sculpted his neuroanatomy to fit the exact specifications of a 1980s television comedy. But in doing so, they stripped him of the foundational cognitive tools required to function as a healthy human being in the real world. The neurochemical reinforcement he received on set left him fundamentally unequipped to navigate the lack of artificial stimulation once the production concluded. Both Bateman and Bonsall were trapped in the same invisible prison. One was forced to incinerate her physical form to satisfy an aesthetic quota. The other had his cerebral cortex chemically reprogrammed to satisfy an audience. They were both feeding their own flesh, bone, and brain matter into the machinery of the studio. But as horrific as this on-set reality was, it was only the incubation period. The true cruelty of the Hollywood machine is not how it extracts resources from the human body, but the absolute cold-blooded efficiency with which it disposes of the body once the resources are depleted or when the machinery is damaged. The rules of survival on a sitcom set are brutal, but the rules of termination are psychopathic. The incubation of trauma on a television soundstage is a silent process. The dissolving of esophageal tissue and the rewiring of a child's dopamine receptors happen quietly, hidden behind closed doors and masked by professional smiles. However, the Hollywood machine does not solely rely on slow internal degradation. There comes a point in the life cycle of a television production when the system's underlying psychopathy is forced out into the open. This occurs when an actor's physical body suffers catastrophic external damage, or when the financial algorithms of the network dictate that a human being is no longer a profitable asset. This is the termination phase. It is the moment the machine reveals its true nature. It does not view the cast as a family or even as human employees. It views them as industrial machinery. And the rules governing defective or obsolete machinery are entirely devoid of empathy. You are either functional or you are eliminated. Before reaching the pinnacle of sitcom fame, Scott Valentine, who played Nick Moore on Family Ties, suffered a catastrophic collision. He was struck by a truck, resulting in a shattered femur and devastating orthopedic trauma that required years of brutal recovery. When he entered the sitcom machine, his skeletal structure was permanently compromised, yet the production schedule for a network television show does not recognize chronic pain or biological limits. The cameras roll, and the actor is expected to hit their mark. Valentine was forced to navigate the high-intensity demands of physical comedy on a deeply damaged chassis. To merely stand upright and deliver the energetic performance the network required meant fighting a daily war against his own nervous system. He had to chemically numb his body's alarm bells with heavy painkillers just to survive the shooting schedule. Between takes, he would collapse, his body trembling from the exertion. The studio executives did not care about the agonizing biomechanical friction happening inside his legs. They only saw a functional asset delivering the required product on schedule. He survived by physically torturing himself to meet the machine's relentless demands. But the Hollywood system does not only eliminate those who are broken, sometimes it eliminates those who are simply no longer required by the financial algorithm. and it does so with a cold, silent efficiency that is even more chilling than physical trauma. The psychopathic nature of the studio's disposal mechanism is best exposed by contrasting Valentine's desperate fight for physical survival with the silent, systematic erasure of a child actor named Josh Byrne. Josh Byrne was cast as Brendan Lambert, the youngest son on the massive 1990s sitcom hit Step by Step. For a child actor, being cast as a core family member on a successful sitcom is not just a job, it becomes the defining architecture of their entire existence. From the age of 7 to the age of 13, Byrne practically lived on the Warner Brothers lot. For 6 formative years, his daily routine, his education, his social interactions, and his sense of identity were completely fused with the production of the show. The cast members become a surrogate family. The crew members are constant fixtures in the child's life. The child's brain, much like Brian Bonzel's, maps its reality based on the predictable rhythm of table reads, rehearsals, tape nights, and the artificial validation of the studio audience. For 6 seasons, Byrne hit his marks. He delivered his lines. He played the cute, innocent youngest child, providing the specific demographic appeal the network required. He did not break the rules. He did not cause scandals. He operated exactly as the machine intended. Then the financial landscape of network television shifted. At the end of its 6th season, Step by Step was canceled by the ABC network. However, the show was immediately acquired by a rival network, CBS, for a shortened 7th and final season. When a show moves networks, the new executives immediately audit the production to maximize profit margins. They look at the cast list not as a family unit, but as a spreadsheet of line item expenses. The CBS executives determined that keeping the entire cast was too expensive. They needed to trim the budget. They looked at Josh Byrne, now a young teenager, no longer the adorable little kid, and therefore less marketable to the target demographic. And they made a purely mathematical decision. They executed a system deletion. When production resumed for the 7th season on CBS, Josh Byrne was not called back. In the real world, when a family member leaves, there is a process. There is a narrative. If a child goes away to boarding school or goes to live with a relative, it is discussed. It is acknowledged. But the sitcom machine does not owe its disposable parts an explanation or narrative closure. The producers of Step by Step did not write a touching farewell episode for Brendan Lambert. They did not write a single line of dialogue for the parents, played by Patrick Duffy and Suzanne Summers, explaining where their youngest son had gone. They did not even bother to show an empty chair at the kitchen table. They simply erased him from existence. When the 7th season premiered, the Lambert Foster family carried on exactly as before, completely oblivious to the fact that their youngest son had vanished into thin air. Brendan Lambert was scrubbed from the universe of the show with the terrifying efficiency of a totalitarian regime, erasing a political dissident from a photograph. This is the ultimate horrifying proof of the industry's cold-blooded nature. Consider the psychological impact on the human boy behind the character. For 6 years, Josh Byrne was conditioned to believe he was an integral part of a family unit that was adored by millions of Americans. He had given his childhood to the studio. He had followed their rules. And then, with the stroke of an accountant's pen, the network communicated the most devastating message a developing adolescent mind can receive. You never mattered. Your presence was an illusion. We can erase your entire existence and no one will even mention your name. When we place these two events side by side, the full terrifying scope of the sitcom studio's elimination protocol is revealed. The contrast is the core of the crime. On one side, we have Scott Valentine, a young man operating on a permanently compromised skeletal structure. The system demanded he stand up and perform high-energy comedy regardless of the chronic pain radiating from his previously shattered femur. He was forced to endure blinding physical agony, heavily medicated simply to prove he was a viable product. He maintained his employment only by voluntarily subjecting himself to daily physical torture. On the other side, we have Josh Byrne, a healthy child who did exactly what he was told for 6 years. He was not broken. He simply became a budgetary inconvenience during a corporate merger. The system looked at this child, deemed him mathematically inefficient, and erased his presence without a single word of explanation. He was simply removed from the narrative. The system operated on strict financial logic rather than sentimentality. Whether an actor was pushing through severe physical pain to meet a production schedule or a child was abruptly released from their contract, the underlying principle remained the same. Performers were assets, utilized when profitable and discarded when they no longer fit the corporate formula. There is no loyalty, there is no family, there is only the product, the air date, and the profit margin. But what happens when the final episode airs? What happens when the machine finally shuts down, the sets are dismantled, and the actors who survived the physical torture and the psychological programming are pushed out into the real world? The studio takes its profits and moves on to the next batch of fresh faces. But the actors cannot simply reboot. They are forced to walk away carrying the massive biological and neurological debts they accrued while trapped inside the box. And as we will see, when the artificial lights go out, the true nightmare begins. The damage inflicted on the soundstage does not stay on the soundstage. It festers, mutates, and ultimately consumes them. The cancellation of a network television sitcom is executed with the same unsentimental efficiency as the shuttering of a manufacturing plant. The massive sound stages are powered down, the heavy tungsten lighting grids are lowered and stripped, and the meticulously constructed sets, the living rooms and kitchens that millions of viewers believe to be real, are unceremoniously dismantled by union carpenters and thrown into industrial dumpsters. For the viewing audience, the end of a show like Family Ties is a minor fleeting disappointment. For the network executives, it is a simple reallocation of broadcast real estate. But for the actors who spent their formative years confined within those walls, the cancellation is a violent biological eviction. They are abruptly pushed out of a highly controlled synthetic biosphere and forced back into the unregulated reality of the outside world. Crucially, they do not leave the studio empty-handed. The Hollywood machine does not offer severance packages or medical rehabilitation. When the actors walk out the gates of the studio lot for the last time, they carry with them the massive, irreversible biological and neurological debts they were forced to accrue in order to survive the production cycle. When the cameras stop rolling and the artificial lights go out, the true nightmare begins. The damage inflicted on the soundstage is not left behind. It is hardwired into their anatomy. The sheer magnitude of this physical debt is evident in the physiological aftermath of Justine Bateman's tenure on television. When the final episode wrapped, Bateman was no longer bound by the wardrobe parameters of Mallory Keaton, yet the biological toll remained. The repeated exposure to gastric acid had permanently compromised her lower esophageal sphincter, leading to severe gastroesophageal reflux disease. Beyond the internal scarring, her dental structure required extensive and painful reconstruction. The machine had taken its toll, leaving her to rebuild a physiological foundation that had been eroded for the sake of an on-screen image. But the most insidious debt was psychological. The sitcom machine had trained her central nervous system to equate her physical volume with her right to exist. For a decade, her brain had been conditioned to view her own flesh and bone as a highly scrutinized, malleable commodity owned by a corporation. When she was released into the real world, this dysmorphia did not evaporate. She was forced to undertake the agonizing, decades-long process of attempting to construct a human identity that was not dictated by the numbers on a scale or the focal length of a camera lens. She survived the machine, but she survived with a compromised biological chassis, paying the physical price for a show that was still generating millions in syndication revenue for executives who never once asked about the state of her internal organs. Yet while Bateman's aftermath was characterized by chronic physical pain and biological repair, the post-studio reality for Brian Bonsall was an apocalyptic neurological collapse. When Brian Bonsall ceased to be the adorable child star of Family Ties, the fundamental architecture of his daily reality vanished overnight. The scripts disappeared. The designated marks on the floor vanished. Most devastatingly, the studio audience went home. To a normal human being, a quiet room is standard existence. To Brian Bonsall's brain, a quiet room was a state of severe, agonizing chemical starvation. During his critical developmental years, the studio had hijacked his neurobiology. They had placed his developing brain inside a behavioral conditioning loop, utilizing the explosive sound of hundreds of cheering adults to trigger massive, unnatural floods of dopamine in his ventral tegmental area. His brain had physically adapted to this synthetic environment. To process the constant artificial dopamine surges, his brain had engaged in a process called receptor down-regulation. It had reduced the number of active dopamine receptors to protect itself from overstimulation. When the show ended and the applause stopped, Bonsall was left with a down-regulated, structurally altered neural network that was suddenly deprived of its primary chemical fuel. This induced a state of profound clinical anhedonia, the absolute biological inability to experience pleasure or satisfaction from normal everyday stimuli. A conversation, a meal, a walk outside, none of these standard human experiences could produce enough dopamine to register on his blunted receptors. His baseline state of existence became a hollow, crushing void. He had been trained by the network to exist at an emotional volume of 10. When the real world required him to live at a volume of 3, his brain registered it as complete silence. The human nervous system cannot tolerate this kind of profound chemical vacuum. It will aggressively seek out a replacement stimulus capable of bridging the gap, regardless of the destructive consequences. For Bonsall, the pursuit of a chemical substitute capable of mimicking the intense instantaneous validation of a sitcom audience led him directly to the most efficient dopamine-releasing agent on the planet, crystal methamphetamine. From a neurochemical perspective, the introduction of methamphetamine hydrochloride into Bonsall's brain was an act of total systemic devastation. Methamphetamine does not simply mimic dopamine. It forces the presynaptic neurons to dump their entire reserve of dopamine into the synaptic cleft, while simultaneously blocking the reuptake transporters. This creates a catastrophic, neurotoxic flood of neurotransmitters. For a brief blinding moment, the drug replicated the exact neurological sensation he had been trained to crave by the television studio. It replaced the missing applause. It filled the void. But the cost of this artificial validation was the rapid, aggressive destruction of his remaining neural architecture. The physical manifestation of this neurological decay was documented with chilling clarity in the public record. The cherubic, smiling child who had charmed millions of American families was entirely erased, replaced by the grim, terrifying reality of his police booking photographs. Look closely at the mugshots of Brian Bonsall as an adult. They are the forensic evidence of a system failure. His face is gaunt, the subcutaneous fat burned away by the hypermetabolic state induced by the stimulant. His neck is heavily branded with stark black butterfly tattoos, a visual marker of his complete detachment from the clean-cut aesthetic the studio had once forced upon him. But the most disturbing element is his eyes. The pupils are blown wide open, dilated to the very edge of the iris, swimming in a dark pool of chemical toxicity. There is no warmth, no recognition, no connection. It is the vacant, predator-like stare of a biological organism that has been stripped of its higher executive functions, driven solely by the primal screaming need of its addicted limbic system. The sitcom machine had meticulously programmed Bonsall to be a punchline delivery system, but it had entirely neglected to teach him the fundamental mechanisms of emotional regulation, impulse control, or conflict resolution. On a soundstage, if a conflict arises, it is resolved within 22 minutes by a team of professional writers. In the real world, conflict requires empathy, patience, and a stable frontal lobe. Bonsall possessed none of these tools. His brain had been fried by meth and stunted by television. The inevitable result of this neurological short circuit was an eruption of uncontrolled, devastating physical violence. In December 2009, the malfunctioning wiring of Bonsall's brain reached a critical violent climax. During an altercation in a Colorado apartment, the lack of emotional regulation, the exact inability the studio had fostered, culminated in a terrifying display of blunt force trauma. Bonsall did not process the argument using logic or verbal de-escalation. Stripped of his inhibitions by a massive intake of illicit substances, his compromised brain defaulted to pure, unthinking aggression. He picked up a heavy, solid wooden bar stool and weaponized it. He repeatedly, viciously bludgeoned his friend in the face and head. The kinetic force of the heavy wood striking human bone was catastrophic, leaving the victim with severe facial lacerations and contusions. This was not a minor scuffle. It was an act of savage, unrestrained brutality. When the police arrived, they did not find a former child star. They found a volatile, highly dangerous addict who had to be physically restrained and booked on charges of second-degree assault. The trajectory is undeniable. The studio took a highly plastic, developing 5-year-old brain. They manipulated its reward centers with artificial validation for financial gain. They discarded him when the show ended without providing any psychological off-ramp. They left him with a chemical dependency on extreme stimulation, which he replaced with a highly neurotoxic street drug, ultimately resulting in the violent physical assault of another human being. The blood spilled in that Colorado apartment is directly connected to the applause sign hanging in the NBC soundstage. It is the final horrifying output of an industrial process that utilizes human children as raw materials. Justine Bateman and Brian Bonsall are the physical evidence of what occurs when the lights go out. They demonstrate that the Hollywood sitcom machine does not merely consume your present, it actively destroys your future. It dismantles your internal organs and rewires your central nervous system, leaving you to navigate the rest of your life trapped inside a body and a mind that were permanently damaged for the amusement of a television audience. But they are not isolated incidents. They are merely components of a much larger, much more ruthless system of elimination and destruction. To fully grasp the sociopathic nature of this industry, we must look beyond the individual bodies and examine the cold, calculated mechanics of the machine itself as it continues its relentless search for the next generation of disposable human assets. The immediate aftermath of a sitcom's cancellation is rarely characterized by a dramatic explosion. Instead, it is defined by a sudden, deafening biological silence. When the production ecosystem that sustains shows like Family Ties and Step by Step is dismantled, the actors are not simply losing employment. They are being abruptly ejected from a highly calibrated life support system. The full catastrophic scope of the aftermath is exposed by examining the specific neurological deficits created by long-term confinement within the studio system and the cold, calculated legal mechanisms the networks employ to isolate themselves from the resulting human wreckage. When an actor, particularly one who entered the machine during adolescence, is expelled into the unregulated environment of the real world, they suffer from a severe, observable condition, the total collapse of executive functioning. The human brain relies on the prefrontal cortex to navigate daily existence. This region of the brain is responsible for complex cognitive behavior, decision-making, the moderation of social behavior, and the calculation of long-term consequences. In a normal developmental environment, a human builds these neural pathways through trial and error, learning to manage time, secure resources, and anticipate the outcomes of their actions. However, within the biosphere of a television studio, the prefrontal cortex is rendered entirely obsolete. The studio operates as an external corporate frontal lobe for the actor. Every single logistical variable of the actor's existence is meticulously managed by a hierarchy of production staff. Transportation is provided. Nutritional intake is regulated by craft services. Daily schedules are printed on call sheets and strictly enforced by assistant directors. Even verbal output is predetermined by a team of scriptwriters, while spatial movement is dictated by the director's blocking marks taped to the floor. The actor is never required to anticipate a consequence or plan a sequence of events. They are only required to execute immediate, short-term commands. When the contract is terminated, this external support structure vanishes instantly. The actor is suddenly forced to operate a human body in a complex society using a prefrontal cortex that has severely atrophied from years of total disuse. This neurological deficit explains the chaotic, seemingly irrational trajectory of discarded actors. When former child stars or teenage idols engage in erratic behavior, the tabloid media frequently categorizes it as a moral failing, a lack of discipline, or the cliché of the wild Hollywood party phase. From a forensic and neurobiological perspective, this is a fundamental misdiagnosis. Their inability to maintain financial stability, navigate interpersonal relationships, or avoid substance dependency is not a moral choice. It is the direct result of structural brain damage caused by environmental deprivation. They are attempting to process the overwhelming unscripted variables of reality with a cognitive engine that was deliberately stunted to make them compliant employees. They were trained to follow the tape marks on the floor. When there is no tape on the floor of the real world, their internal navigation systems fail completely. As these biological and neurological failures begin to manifest publicly, whether through rapid weight fluctuations, arrests, or visible substance dependency, the Hollywood machine initiates its secondary defense protocol, the corporate firewall. The networks that generated billions of dollars from the physical and emotional labor of these actors are acutely aware of the damage inflicted on their sets. However, the industry is built upon a foundation of absolute liability deflection. The system is designed to entirely separate the pathology of the actor from the environment of the studio. When a former sitcom star's life visibly disintegrates, the network's public relations machinery operates with surgical precision to isolate the brand. The narrative is aggressively shifted from industrial injury to personal tragedy. If an actor develops a severely eroded digestive tract from years of forced, stress-induced regurgitation to meet weight quotas, the network does not acknowledge the high-pressure environment they created. Instead, the medical condition is framed entirely as a private, individual battle with an eating disorder, a personal psychological flaw that the network had no part in fostering. If a former child actor's manipulated dopamine receptors drive them toward highly neurotoxic chemical substitutes resulting in erratic or violent behavior, the network expresses generic, detached sympathy. They utilize the media to frame the individual as a troubled soul who unfortunately succumbed to the temptations of fame. The narrative intentionally ignores the fact that the studio artificially wired the child's brain to require those massive, unsustainable chemical surges in the first place. This is a highly effective, cold-blooded legal and PR strategy. By pathologizing the individual, the system immunizes itself. The studio transforms the victim of their industrial process into the sole author of their own destruction. The machine washes its hands, protecting its syndication value and its family-friendly image, while the defective human component is left to decay in the public eye, bearing the full weight of the blame. This brings us to the final, most insidious form of psychological torture inflicted upon the discarded sitcom actor, the phenomenon of syndication. In standard industries, when a worker is injured and discarded, they are allowed to retreat into anonymity. They can attempt to heal, age, and rebuild their lives away from the environment that broke them. The television industry explicitly denies its victims this basic human right. Shows like Family Ties and Step by Step do not disappear when production ceases. They are packaged, sold into syndication, and broadcast repeatedly, 24 hours a day, across global networks. This creates a permanent, inescapable feedback loop of psychological dissonance. The forensic reality is inescapable. The biological body of the actor ages in real time. Their physical form is degrading, bearing the heavy, painful scars of their time in the machine, the eroded dental enamel, the compromised immune system, the neurochemical exhaustion. They look in the mirror and see the accurate anatomical reality of a human being who has been utilized, damaged, and discarded. But every time they turn on a television, they are forced into a visual confrontation with their own ghost. They are forced to watch a two-dimensional, mathematically optimized, perfectly lit version of their former anatomy. They see themselves at the exact moment of their peak exploitation, smiling, delivering punchlines, and projecting an aura of absolute flawless health. This creates a state of permanent cognitive friction. The public does not want the aging, damaged, real-world biological organism. They only want the frozen, synthetic avatar trapped inside the television screen. The actor is forced to compete with a digital phantom of themselves that never ages, never gets sick, and never requires medical intervention. They are trapped in a societal purgatory. They cannot move forward because the world refuses to let them age, constantly comparing their current degraded physical state to the high-definition footage of their youth. The audience looks at the broken adult and asks, "What happened to you?" Completely oblivious to the fact that they are currently watching the exact footage of the machinery that caused the break. The syndication royalties, often fractions of pennies on the dollar for the actors, serve as a constant mocking reminder that their youth and their health were permanently extracted and monetized. The network continues to harvest financial capital from the actor's past, while the actor is left bankrupt in the present, struggling to pay medical bills for the biological damage incurred while filming those exact episodes. This is the ultimate triumph of the Hollywood machine. It figures out a way to grant the product immortality while ensuring the human being who generated it is left to rot. The studio lights may be turned off and the sets may be destroyed, but the actors remain permanently tethered to the slaughterhouse. Their physical and mental deterioration broadcast in endless, lucrative reruns. The autopsy of the 1980s and 1990s sitcom era does not require the examination of studio archives, network memos, or Nielsen ratings. The true, unimpeachable record of what transpired inside those soundstages is not written on paper. It is permanently encoded into the biological and neurological architecture of the actors who survived it. When we step back and view the entire operational cycle of this industry, from the initial psychological confinement on set through the cold-blooded elimination protocols and into the devastating biological aftermath, a horrifying reality solidifies. The family sitcom was not a genre of benign entertainment. It was a highly efficient, unregulated industrial process that extracted raw emotional and physical energy from human beings, processed it into a synthetic visual product, and discarded the toxic biological byproducts onto the street. The absolute sociopathy of this system is hidden within the broadcast product itself. A specific mechanism allowed this massive systemic abuse to occur in plain sight, broadcast directly into millions of homes without triggering a single alarm. The primary cloaking device of the sitcom machine was auditory. It was the laugh track. From a psychological perspective, canned laughter is not merely a background sound effect. It is a highly engineered, coercive acoustic tool. It is designed to manipulate the auditory processing centers of the viewer's brain, artificially signaling that the environment on screen is safe, humorous, and devoid of genuine threat. When an actor was standing on set, their central nervous system flooded with cortisol from the terror of concealing a degenerative neurological disease. The laugh track masked the tension. When a young woman stepped in front of the camera, her esophagus burning from freshly regurgitated hydrochloric acid and her heart rate spiking from malnutrition, the laugh track instructed the audience to perceive her physical fragility as comedic physical comedy. When a child actor with a hijacked, dopamine-starved brain delivered a line, the explosive, pre-recorded applause validated the neurochemical abuse. The laugh track functioned as an industrial noise-canceling mechanism. It drowned out the sound of bone grinding against surgical steel. It muffled the biological alarms of failing immune systems. It served as an acoustic firewall between the active suffering of the human organism on the sound stage and the passive consumption of the viewer in the living room. The audience was neurologically tricked into participating in a collective hallucination, believing they were witnessing a family, when in reality they were watching a hostage situation. This acoustic manipulation allowed the networks to operate with absolute impunity. Because the final broadcast product was aggressively sanitized and engineered to trigger comfort, the extreme physical and psychological violations required to manufacture that comfort were rendered completely invisible. The Hollywood machine weaponized the audience's desire for wholesome entertainment, using it as a shield to protect a deeply abusive labor environment. The true horror of the sitcom curse lies in its asymmetry. The exchange of energy was entirely parasitic. The viewing public utilized these shows as a form of emotional regulation. Millions of people tuned in to Family Ties, or Step by Step, to temporarily soothe their own anxieties, to experience 22 minutes of guaranteed resolution, and to feel the warmth of a stable family unit. But human warmth cannot be synthesized out of thin air. It must be extracted from a biological source. The audience outsourced its need for psychological stability to a group of actors who were being actively, systematically destabilized to provide it. The viewers extracted comfort while the actors absorbed the trauma. The audience received 30 minutes of dopamine. The child actors received permanent structural alterations to their prefrontal cortexes. The audience consumed the image of a flawless teenager. The young actresses paid for that image by dissolving their own internal organs and stripping the enamel from their teeth. Audiences sought comfort in these broadcast narratives, largely oblivious to the significant physical and psychological toll required to sustain the illusion. When the era of the traditional multi-camera sitcom finally began to wane, the industry did not face a reckoning. There were no congressional hearings regarding the neurological manipulation of child performers. There were no occupational safety investigations into the extreme physical quotas that drove adult actors to self-mutilation. The network simply pivoted. They dismantled the living room sets, adjusted their formatting, and applied the exact same predatory mechanics to new genres, new platforms, and a new generation of disposable human assets. The illusion of the 1980s and 90s television family remains perfectly preserved in the vacuum of syndication. The reruns continue to broadcast an alternate reality where actions have no permanent consequences, where bodies never degrade, and where trauma is always resolved before the final commercial break. But the physical evidence of the crime cannot be syndicated. The evidence is walking among us. The evidence is written in the permanent fibrous scar tissue lining the digestive tracts of women who were taught that their flesh was a liability. It is recorded in the orthopedic x-rays of men who were forced to bear the weight of corporate profit on shattered, improperly healed bones. It is documented in the police booking photographs and the toxicology reports of adults who are still frantically searching for the artificial chemical validation that a television network hardwired into their brains when they were 5 years old. These actors are the collateral damage of a system that views the human body not as a sacred, fragile vessel, but as a temporary casing for a profitable image. They were pushed into the machinery, compressed into the strict, unforgiving dimensions of a television screen, and held there until their biology buckled under the pressure. The sitcom sets of this era function primarily as highly efficient corporate assets, prioritizing syndication value over the long-term developmental and physical health of the performers. The demands placed upon these actors, both physical and psychological, were immense, carefully hidden behind the glare of studio lights and the predictable rhythm of a laugh track. The damage inflicted in those windowless rooms is permanent. It is etched into the medical records, the police blotters, and the scarred anatomy of the survivors. The illusion has been entirely dismantled. The permanent human cost can no longer be hidden by the glare of the studio lights or the deafening roar of a pre-recorded laugh track. If you found this analysis of television history insightful, please consider subscribing. Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know which industry narrative or historical figure we should examine next. The machinery of entertainment is constantly evolving, and examining its past is essential to understanding its present.